Hey, Bob. Okay, John, I think we can start. I think we'll start. Well, good afternoon. I want to welcome you to the second in our fall Liberal Studies lecture series on Dr. Todd McPartland, the director of the Whitney Young School. And we will also have a lecture next week that will be on a very different topic, on the collaboration of music and literature. So I'm in the unusual position of being the host, and I'm going to introduce myself as a lecturer. So briefly, the background here for why I'm giving this lecture. For years I taught a course on the history of revolutions before I came to KSU, and I taught times here. I've attended a conference in Hong Kong a few years ago, a conference on revolutions, and a book has come out of that, and I have a chapter in this book on revolutions, and I will draw from that to some extent today. I will read some of the material so that I don't go off on a tangent and talk for because we clearly can a long time on this topic. Right now, one of our honor students is passing out an outline. I'm not going to use PowerPoint. If I did, I would probably want to do it on Halloween, which would be more appropriate for the subject matter. In fact, it might be too grisly and disgusting for Halloween. But this is a serious topic. What I want to do is establish what I consider to be the most prominent features of what I'll call radical revolution, and I'll go over its history in some detail, as you see in the outline that's being distributed. Once I do that, and I'll have some historical generalizations, I will then go back to Islamic revolution, and then at the end I will mention ISIS, not the goddess, but this group that no longer wants to be called ISIS or ISIL, but simply the Islamic Republic. And we don't know, a lot about it, but I think if I can identify the species of radical revolution, you'll see that ISIS is clearly a member of that species, and it will tell us a lot about that organization. So I'm going to start by giving you an account of radical revolution before I define it. I will simply read you a brief description of something that unfortunately really happened. Zero events in April 1970, according to what happened.
The Khmer Rouge seized the capital city of Phnom Penh. The entire population was marched out into the countryside, including the lame and infirm, who were dragged from hospitals. The very young and old began to fall by the wayside and die. This was only a harbinger of things to come. The new country of Kampuchea was proclaimed with its new calendar as a symbol of a new society. Relations with all governments except China were cut off. The party elite, led by Pol Pot, who had been trained as an engineer at the Sorbonne, had the momentous task of completely destroying the corrupt old society and creating the society of the people. The social engineering meant the eradication of urban life, of the accoutrements of modern Western life, including postal systems, currency, telephone, and medicine, of the family and of individualism. This eradication required an unrelenting war against the enemies of the people. Concretely, death to army officers, civil servants, teachers, policemen, and any associated with the old regime, to anyone educated, to those who violated the strict new rules of behavior. So ensued a reign of torture, terror, and mass killing. While the methods were often primitive, given the assault on modern civilization, the results were effective with the use of such implements as axe handles, disembowelment, and burying alive. Perhaps up to a quarter of the population perished in the killing fields. From perhaps several 100,000 to some estimates 2 million. The Khmer justify these drastic measures because previous attempts at revolution in Russia, China, and elsewhere were, in their minds, failures. Only in Kampuchea was there true revolution. Indeed, this was a revolution in the most radical sense. So that gives you an idea of what radical revolution is all about. I'm going to follow this outline. Sometimes just talking from it, sometimes we refer to my paper. Now, we do live in the modern world in an age, what we call an age of revolutions. We are in an age of constant technological, economic, social, political, and cultural change. And we constantly use the word revolution. There's a revolution in medicine. There's a revolution in sexual mores. There's a revolution in technology. We use terms in history to refer to such topics as the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution. Oh yes, we also talk about political revolution. The term revolution is used here in a very general sense, and in a way it's quite appropriate to describe perhaps the key features of our modern world as an era of unprecedented, rapid, ongoing, continuous change. But where does this word revolution come from, and why do I use it when I say the history of revolution? Why do I refer to revolution in a much more strict sense than this general sense? The general sense of revolution means an irreversible, significant change or attempt at change. I'm using it in a much more strict sense. The term revolution first appeared in prominence with the publication of Copernicus' work, De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, the revolution of the heavenly spheres. The word, of course, referred to the revolution of the stars. The notion of revolving was applied in the 17th century to the revolving of forms of government as articulated in classic fashion by the ancient historian Polybius in his work on the Roman Constitution. The natural course of forms of government, according to Polybius, was the revolving of kingship into tyranny, tyranny into aristocracy, aristocracy into oligarchy, oligarchy into democracy, democracy into mob rule, and mob rule revolving back to kingship. The so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688 in England was seen by its supporters as a revolving of tyranny into aristocracy with a constitutional monarchy. But the use of the term revolution carried other overtones in Italy, starting in the 14th century. They used two words, revoluzione and revogamento, to mean extraordinary alteration of government by force. This term was largely a slang term. It was in the vernacular. But it did begin to enter into political discourse during the 1640s when there were crises, political crises both in England and in France. They were used, nevertheless, in a politically incorrect way in the margins. However, by the 18th century, this term revolution was used by the leaders of the Enlightenment in France, the philosophers, to refer to important, significant cultural change. They gave this term its meaning because of their notion of the idea of progress. By the 1780s, the term began first to be used in a political context and became massively used because of the French Revolution. I would argue the French Revolution is the most important political event in the last few centuries in the world. In the wake of the French Revolution, that term revolution was applied retrospectively to the American War of Independence. Now, the experience of the French Revolution, I'll say something about it in a few minutes in more detail. The experience of the French Revolution not only conveyed the sense of irreversible significant change, but also of irreversible significant change on such a scale as to be molded by historical forces beyond the individual, if not human, control. But it did more. That term also conveyed a sense of change of great quantitative magnitude, but also it referred to a sense of great qualitative change. The word revolution, as applied to the French Revolution, was linked to an idea, And the idea was associated with certain sentiments, symbols, and aspirations that long antedated the French Revolution, that burst out in its most powerful and transformative way in the French Revolution, and would come close to dominating the Western political landscape and much of the world political landscape in the 20th century. Referring to this phenomenon, that revolutionary sentiments, aspirations, the radical sort that I was talking about, can be expressed and associated with various ideas. So we have to differentiate the idea of revolution from the sentiments and aspirations behind it. You will find both religious ideas and secular ideas, but both of them driven by these radical revolutionary sentiments. Let me then define what I mean by radical revolution, the sense that you got from the activity of the French Revolution. And I've given you the definition at the bottom of your outline. By radical revolution, and this is a very, very narrow interpretation. By radical revolution, I mean transform human consciousness and human nature, eliminating the major source of evil in society. The ultimate nature of radical revolution then deals with evil in theological terms. It's soteriological. It has to do with salvation from evil. Without this element, we do not have radical revolution. Now, we may think, well, it's really narrow and we don't have much to talk about here today. Unfortunately, that's not true. Radical revolution, as I'm talking about it, is not merely an assassination, a rebellion of officials, a change of dynasty, a division of monarchy, a peasant revolt, a civil war, a war of independence, or a conquest. Nor is it merely a coup d'etat or a change of form of government. A revolution may involve any of those factors that I just mentioned if it is driven by an ideology that seeks total transformation by taking the axe to the root of evil. Hence, it is radical, taking the axe to the roots of evil. That is why it can justify violence and why it needs to resort to violence, since the forces of evil will not give up peacefully in the face of total opposition. This is why it must engage in some program of social change beyond ordinary politics, since social change in the eyes of the radical revolutionaries is both the cause and effect of changing human consciousness and human nature. An attempt at radical revolution that does not seize power is a revolutionary movement. An attempt at radical revolution that seizes power and starts to implement a program of drastic social change is a radical revolution. It is also total revolution. Now let me refer now to my outline here. Radical revolution is not normal. Most of human societies, throughout most of human history, most of human cultures are not revolutionary in this sense. Most tribal societies have some contact with some larger order of things mediated by a medicine man, witch doctor, or shaman. The earliest civilizations in Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, the Yellow River, the Andes, Central America, all had a form of civilization under the auspices of sacred kingship, where the king, the pharaoh, the ruler, the emperor, mediated between ordered human society and the cosmic divine order. This was the normal way of conducting government. Or as the Ur-3 dynasty kingless from 2000 BC in Mesopotamia put it, when kingship was lowered from heaven. This notion of things did not lend itself to the idea of radically transforming society. Their view of proper social behavior was living in accordance with the traditions of things and the proper order established in the beginning, or from all eternity, depending upon their religious perspective. When we look at the large empires that dominated the history from late antiquity until the modern period, and in the case of China until 1911, these large empires that claimed universal rule the Roman Empire, the Persian Empire, the various dynasties in China, the Caliphate, they all appeal to the same notion of divine kingship or order from above and a pre-established order. If we were to look at the political philosophies of ancient Greece and see the development from Plato's Republic to the statesman to the laws, the politics of Aristotle, we see that wisdom contained in the work of Polybius, whom I just mentioned, and his notion found in his description of the Roman Constitution. The correct way to establish order in society is not to eliminate evil, but to contain it by a constitution of checks and balances. That very idea informed the framers of the U.S. Constitution in creating a Constitution with its checks and balances and separation of powers to contain evil, not to eliminate it as radical revolutionaries would want to do. So, and I could go on with all sorts of historical data that radical revolution is not normal. So, why do we find it at all? Where do these sentiments come from? Let me give you another concrete example. Let's turn to China. During the Han Dynasty, and focus on the yellow turbans. They were fueled by a literalist belief in the restoration of the golden age of Tai Ping mentioned in the Taoist scripture. The earlier presence of some Taoist ideas regarding the Tai Ping were found in earlier political philosophies, but nothing along this radical order. In the waning years of the Han Dynasty, amid severe agrarian crises, three brothers, under the banners of these Taoist ideas, sparked rebellion in the Yellow River Valley. But the rebellion turned into a radical revolution. It was a messianic movement which aimed at the total overthrow of the Han Dynasty and the overthrow of the established monarchical order to return to the original state of purity, the Taiping, under a theocratic regime. The yellow turbans had all the classical features of a radical revolutionary movement. It arose in a time of great disaster and political turmoil. It was led by those proclaiming special wisdom. It consisted of followers who were from the destitute of society, sought the elimination of the major source of evil in society, including the evil Mandarin rulers of China, and it believed this political action would transform, or, in their view, at least restore human nature. In the year AD 184, the Yellow Turbans formed an army of about 360,000, organized into religious communities, rites and ceremonies, and into trances, purification, confessions, and sexual activities. The revolution was put down mercilessly by the Han warlords. These revolutionary ideas, however, continued in secret societies in China. They would emerge again centuries later with the Red Turbans, who awaited the reincarnation of the Buddhist Bodhisattva who would usher in the perfect society after liberating China from the Mongols. These ideas again surfaced, mixed in with Christian ideas of salvation. The more famous Tai Ping rebellion of the 19th century, in which at least 20 million were killed in the attempt to overthrow the decadent Manchu dynasty and establish a utopian regime on earth under God. So, another example. Now, as it turns out, the major source of sentiments underlying the idea of revolution come from the complex of experiences and symbols arising from the Israelite religious tradition and becoming part of the other Abrahamic faiths, Christianity and Islam. Now, perhaps the most important event for the ancient Israelites was the Exodus from Egypt. But this was not just an ordinary event. This is an eruption of the divine into history, and it transformed history. There is a before and an after, and the after is radically different. This event itself gave rise to hopes and expectations of perhaps changes in the future. And there are passages in the Old Testament that refer to such a transformation. And images and symbols arise referring to this, such as the New Jerusalem, and God would rule all the nations. There are other complex images found in the book of Daniel about the apocalypse, a time of horrible persecution of those faithful to God that would nevertheless usher in a day when there would be the reign of the saints. To this idea was added the notion in the New Testament book of Revelation that this reign of the saints would last 1,000 years, the idea of the millennium. And so we have notions of the New Jerusalem, the apocalypse, the millennium. And in the Western Middle Ages, to these complex of symbols was added the notion of the third reign of the Spirit based on the speculation of the monk Joachim of Fiora on the three ages of history based on the Trinity. The age of the Father had been superseded by the age of the Son in Christianity, but dawning soon would be the age of the Spirit and transformation of the world. Now these images all bear on salvation. Now let me talk for a moment about the logic of revolutionary symbols with respect to interpretation of these passages, because these passages can be interpreted in a variety of ways. For example, we have the Orthodox Christian interpretation formulated in classic fashion by St. Augustine, who saw these passages as entirely symbolic, referring not to actual events in history, but to the inner struggle of the individual soul and its spiritual destiny. However, and his approach is definitely anti-revolutionary. Nevertheless, if we were to look at the logic of revolutions, we could go through a series of interpretations that head more and more towards radical revolution. The first stage in this continuum is to interpret passages literally to regard the fulfillment as murky and for all practical purposes in the far-off future. The next stage is to claim knowledge of the time of the fulfillment, indeed as coming very soon, but to adopt a completely passive and perhaps prayerful attitude towards the events. The next stage is to claim knowledge of the time of fulfillment as immediate or soon and take up an active, though peaceful, stance. For example, warning people of the coming of this change, and perhaps asking or demanding that people repent, as the flagellant movements were prone to do in the Middle Ages, going around from village to village beating themselves. The final stage on the road to radical revolution is to claim knowledge of the time of fulfillment as immediate or soon, and take up an active and violent stance as a key player in bringing about the very transformation. And we find that this, in fact, has happened in history. So now let me go through all too quickly modern Western history of revolution. So I'll have a few generalizations and then I'll go back to Islamic revolution. And I'm trying to establish the general tendency. In the Middle Ages, in the Western Middle Ages, we do indeed have a trickle of what we call apocalyptic, millennial, and Yoan-type movements, for the most part passive and peaceful, but as time goes on, they become more active and they threaten with violence, and violence breaks out in a few isolated cases. When we get to the Reformation in the 1500s, we begin to see the outbreak of more serious radical revolution. In 1534 and 1535, in the German town of Munster, near the border with Holland, we had Anabaptists, the forerunner of the modern Baptists, who felt persecuted by Catholics and Lutherans at a horrible time, with the Black Death and other famine. So it's an apocalyptic situation, taking over the city of Munster, and eventually kicking out all of the godless ones, namely the Catholics and Lutherans, and proclaiming that the New Jerusalem has arrived, the third age of the Spirit has dawned, the millennium has appeared. Eventually, the man who took over as their leader, establishing a new order of society, establishing communism and polygamy, and he would enforce his dictates by ruthless means and ultimately capital punishment. And so a reign of terror ensued with any who opposed this new regime. The new regime also sent out apostles, as they call them, to spread revolution throughout the world. Many of them reached the city of Amsterdam and attempted to affect the Council of Amsterdam without much success. So we have the enemies within who do not follow the rules, and they have a reign of terror. We also have, as is always the case in these radical revolutions, the enemies from without. And the enemies from without didn't take long to catch. The prince bishop of this territory, plus neighboring nobles, besieged the city, and within a year they took the city and slaughtered most of those who remained, and tortured and executed the leaders. This happened only in one city for 1 year, but it does give us a paradigm of radical revolution. And what happens is we have this trickle of revolutionary movements and a revolutionary regime per year. We have this becoming more than just a trickle. It becomes eventually a flood. Within a century, we have an entire country threatened with a takeover by radical revolutionaries. This is England during the Civil War. The forces who wanted to purify the Church of England, the Puritans, defeated the armies of Charles I, had him executed. And this is what revolutionaries do to monarchs, as opposed to the traditional idea of sacred kingship. They kill kings. They did in England, they will do it in the French Revolution, they will do it in the Russian Revolution, and they will do it in the Ethiopian Revolution. And they wanted to do it in the Iranian Revolution when the Shah escaped from Hannibal. They executed Charles I, and the new Commonwealth of the Puritans was to be established, and they had a constitutional convention. But there were many of the members of that convention, indeed the majority, who were radical revolutionaries of the sort I just mentioned. Oliver Cromwell, in charge of the army, was a moderate revolutionary, and he put the brakes on the whole thing. Disbanded the Constitutional Convention, arrested a group called the Levellers, and made sure that the majority of that convention, the fifth monarchists, had no say. They were fifth monarchists, drawing from biblical images from the book of Daniel, and the four kingdoms that would be replaced by the fifth monarchy. They believed that the next ruler of England would be King Jesus. They were thwarted. Within a century, however, the most populous nation in Europe, the most powerful nation in Europe, the most intellectually advanced nation in Europe, revolution breaks out and a regime successfully takes over. But the idea of revolution is no longer religious. The idea of revolution is secular. Instead of taking a literalist interpretation of the scripture, these revolutionaries take a literalist interpretation of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's The Social Contract and attempt to implement the Republic of Virtue described by Rousseau. I don't have time to go into this in any depth because there's a whole course of revolution. I've outlined different stages. And I think that the ideal type for dealing with any subsequent revolution, they may or may not exactly go in this order, but it helps you to get an analytical tool. At first, the reform moved to overthrow of the manorial system and the constitutional monarch. Then there's the fear of counter-revolution, peasant rebellions in the countryside, foreign nations wanting to threaten to invade, and eventually the leaders of this new regime, the Girondins, in the assembly, declared war on Austria and Russia in 1792. A horrible mistake that ushered in war hysteria and led to the third stage, the terror stage. At first we would call it the terror of circumstance, but perhaps there were genuine needs to really get tough with rebellion in 2/3 of the countryside, foreign armies invading France. But the most remarkable thing is once there was a successful putting down of the rebellion to the countryside and a turning back of foreign armies, the terror did not abate, it did not lessen, it increased. This is the terror of ideology. For the leaders, the Jacobins, under Robespierre and Saint-Denis, attempted to establish the Republic of Virtue. And we have the terror, and they use that word, introduced as a method to bring about a new society. And as Robespierre said himself in his speech, to realize the destiny of history. Unfortunately, they were not as politically astute as later revolutionaries, and there was a reaction by those who feared that they would be executed by the new weapon, the guillotine, and we have the so-called Thermidor reaction in August. In the month of Thermidor, there was a new calendar, of course, created by the revolutionaries. This is the Thermidor reaction that kind of puts the brakes on the revolution. The next important development in the history of revolutions, as a number of revolutions break out in the 19th century in Paris. But in 1848, we have a transformation in the idea of revolution. We see there, for the first time, the red flag of revolution raised in Paris, and now revolution is carrying the ideas of socialism and Marxism. Perhaps it was a surprise that in the backward country of Russia, we would have the first Marxist revolutionary regime. That is what happened in 1917 during the turmoil of the First World War. And we could get time over these own states to see parallels. We do that. We have a radical Bolshevik revolutionary regime that wants to establish true communism in one country. And as a result, we not only have the terror of Lenin, but we have the great terror of Stalin, the creation of the Gulag Archipelago, the system of concentration camps, the murder of millions, the starving of millions in Ukraine to carry out these ideas. At the same, during the Stalinist regime, we have another radical revolutionary movement to take power down with the National Socialists in Germany. They are a radical revolutionary movement. They established a radical revolutionary regime. They were attempting to establish a community of salvation for the German people, a Volksgemeinschaft, a new order of things, and they would eliminate the major source of evil in their whole world, the Jewish conspiracy, as they saw it. But this is a radical revolutionary movement that killed millions. Most of the revolutions in the 20th century have been inspired by the Russian Revolution. And I just listed them. We don't have time, unfortunately, to go into the details. The Chinese Revolution and the Great Proletarian Revolution from Mao Zedong, unique in the history of revolutions, trying to destroy the revolutionary regime itself, to purify it. The Cuban Revolution, Castro and Che Guevara. The Cambodian Revolution, I've already given you a description of that. They felt Mao did not go far enough, and Mao felt that Stalin was, as he called it, a margarine communist, not the real thing, not whatever. The Ethiopian Revolution, led by army officers who engineered the transformation for themselves as apparently reformers, the radical revolutionaries, with a horrible reign of terror, as Dr. Lake showed us. The Nicaraguan Revolution perhaps is not the party was not quite a radical revolution because the Sandinistas eventually negotiated with other groups and had actual elections in 1990, and they lost enough power, but they were at least close to the notion of radical revolution. Grenada, 1983, the attempted revolution there by the Communist Party after killing the charismatic leader of the New Jewel movement who was trying to redistribute the land on behalf of the poor people. That simple-minded but crude leader of the Communist Party led the United States to invade Grenada. Now, let me give you some historical generalizations before I turn to the law. I'll go through these very quickly without really having a chance to go into detail. 9 generalizations stated rather quickly. First, radical revolutions originate from the idea of a divine or spiritual transformation of the human condition. The source of this idea comes from the world religions. The main line is Judeo-Christian in the West. The secondary line, as we see in the moment, is Islamic. The tertiary line is Taoist, the later adventures of Buddhism and Zoroastrianism in China. Second, the idea of revolution can be separated from the engendering sentiments, symbols, and aspirations, as I indicated in the diagram, and take on secular garb, as we've seen in the French Revolution and beyond. Third, in the West, radical revolutions gain in size of operations over the centuries. Fourthly, the later the radical revolutions will tend to occur, the more violent and total they seem to be, as they're building on their predecessors who didn't go far enough. Such will be the case from Al-Qaeda to ISIS. Fifth, radical revolutions embrace both the right and the left. Stalin and Hitler, Castro, and Osama bin Laden. 6, the necessary condition of radical revolution is a complicated triad of bold leaders, willing followers, and favorable circumstances. And by favorable, I don't mean good circumstances. I mean famine, plague, rampant injustice. They thrive on those apocalyptic situations. 7th, radical revolutions, despite the historical sense we have of them and the very feeling of that word during the French Revolution, they are not inevitable. There are all sorts of contingent circumstances that have led to the success of a movement becoming a revolutionary regime. 8th, no radical revolution has succeeded according to its own terms. Thus, we do not see established a New Jerusalem, a fifth monarchy ruled by King Jesus, a republic of virtue, an historically successful Third Reich, a stage of communism, and, so far, a real restoration of palefy. Nor do we see the return of the Mahdi. Revolutionary expectations, of course, can be rekindled in the hope that the next one will prove decisive and final. 9th point is, even though radical revolutions have not succeeded in eliminating the source of evil in society, they have had enormous historical impact. I'm not going to go into any detail on the philosophical encounter, except there are a variety of interpretations of these revolutions by the revolutionaries, by those sympathetic to their goals, if not their tactics. We have some criticism of revolution by those who claim simply Orthodox religion, abolished religion, and end the problem. Now, from this standpoint of the history of revolutions, that could sound itself like a revolutionary sentiment to abolish the main source of evil in society. An opposite point of view would agree there are religious roots to the idea of radical revolution, but religion per se perhaps is not the culprit. Rather, the aberrations come from inauthentic appropriation of religious traditions and failures to negotiate the tensions created by religious differentiations of consciousness that we find in the major religions. Now I want to turn to the Islamic revolution. Given the time, I do want to come back to questions. Be brief, but I want to emphasize some points. This is all leading up now to ISIS. The outbreak of Islam in the 7th century was a historical and unique event. The combination of the universal religions of Islam joined to a universal culture that was created and included Arabic culture and also Hellenic culture, and a world empire, all rolled into one. In a century, Arab armies moved out of Arabia, and by 711, there was an empire stretching from Spain to the subcontinent of India. Since the expansion of Islam was by violence, we might think there's a lot of potential here for radical revolution. But there are a number of factors that guarded against this on the part of the majority of those in the traditional Muslim world. The very success of Muslim forces in establishing a universal empire, they call the Caliphate, had to adjust to some normal political and diplomatic demands as the ruler of a vast territory. The Quran spoke of a kind of tolerance for at least the people of the book, the Christians and the Jews. The Roman Catholics was the majority, the Roman Catholics was there. The majority of tradition of Muslims took on eventually a conservative approach, so that by the year 900 in the Christian world, there was a communal consensus that the 4 great schools of jurisprudence had resolved all issues regarding the divinely ordained laws of Islam, the Sharia, which came from the Hadith or tradition consisting of the Quran and the Sunnah, or practices of the Prophet, as remembered by his companions. And the majority tradition therefore holds as the Sunnis, the followers of the Sunni. But there was an immediate split in the 7th century between two major factions of Islam that I have here in the outline. The question was over the succession to Muhammad. The Umayyad clan was vying with Muhammad Ali and his family for the role. Muhammad Ali was killed in the mid-600s. His son Hussein was later killed in the 600s in the city of Karbala, south of Baghdad, and they still celebrate his death with the Shiites. Because the Shiites are the followers of Ali, Shia. They felt themselves to be a persecuted minority, and indeed there's a sense of an apocalyptic kind of situation that they have to face. They themselves divided into two main groups. They, instead of having a caliph, they had a series of imams, divinely appointed rulers. But there was a dispute about the 7th imam. The 7ers claimed that Ismail was the 7th imam. They were the 7ers. A group of them eventually gained control of Egypt and established the Fatimid dynasty for 2 centuries. Near the end of this dynasty, there was a dispute about the Fatimid rule. And the recalcitrants left Egypt and established themselves in citadels in the mountains of Syria, Iraq, and Persia, present-day Iran. And they declared themselves to be the only legitimate governments in the world. All others, the other 7 are Shiites, the 12 are Shiites, I mentioned in a minute, the Sunnis, let alone the non-Muslims, all illegitimate. They themselves were the only legitimate people in terms of any governance. And their duty was to kill their political opponents. And they established themselves in a particularly noteworthy way. They would frequently have some of their followers insinuate themselves into the households of these opponents, political leaders, Arab or Turk Sunni leaders, or perhaps Crusaders. And eventually, they would be in a position to kill them. And a word has come into our English language that describes them, assassins. They were the assassins. They were the forerunners of suicide bombers. They were destroyed, however, their citadels by the Mongols in the 13th century. The other group of Shia were the Twelvers, who counted up to 12 imams and claimed the 12th imam as a child, left the earth. He was the hidden imam, someday to return to the world. In a way, until then, all governments are only barely legitimate. This group, however, in terms of our logic of revolutionary sentiments, were largely passive. And largely in Iraq, until the 1500s, when a new dynasty was established in Persia, who made 12er Shia Islam the basic religion of the empire. Nevertheless, these 12ers in Iran, as we call it today, were largely passive until a major transformation occurred under the influence of the Ayatollah Khomeini, who took an activist view in a row of 12ers. They could take an active role in preparing the way for the coming of the Mahdi. And in 1979, when he returned from Paris to Tehran, we had a major revolutionary upheaval. We had a radical revolutionary regime established that declared all other regimes basically illegitimate. They wrote all laws of diplomacy and taking, for example, the American embassy. Now we've had a long discussion about where they are in the cycle. Have they reached the terminal stage or not? That has something to do with the viability of negotiations with them having nuclear power and possibly nuclear weapons. But we must turn to the Sunni. I mentioned the Mongols defeated the assassins in the 1200s. They also invaded the entire area of Mesopotamia. And they destroyed the city of Baghdad, which had been the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate for centuries. They killed every Muslim in Baghdad. That was their exit policy. Perhaps 800,000. They let the Christians and Jews survive. This was a catastrophe, the end of the Caliphate in any meaningful sense, although it had been in decline for a couple centuries. This was an apocalyptic situation, and in this situation, we have given Amina take up the stance that there has to be a new radical purging of Islam in this situation. We says, we must go back to the traditions of the forefathers, the Salaf. This is called Salafism. The traditions that he wanted to go back to, and a society that he envisioned, was perhaps one that never existed. He argued that in order to bring this about, holy war, jihad, was necessary not only against foreign enemies like the Mongols and their crusaders, but also, perhaps even more importantly, against the internal enemies, the Muslims who are not faithful. Now, his writings did not immediately affect any political movement, but they were certainly well known. And they came to the fore again in the 1700s, when we had another catastrophe, the decline of the Ottoman Empire that claimed to be carrier now of failure. And in that situation, we had another follower of the Salafist idea, Abd al-Wahhab, who associated himself with the sheikh of the Saudi family, who became Wahhabists, with this idea of radical transformation. Now, the Wahhabists were dealt a serious blow at the beginning of the 1800s when the founder of modern Egypt, Muhammad Ali Pasha, who almost exterminated the group with horrible punishments and impalings and sent their leaders to Constantinople, the capital of the Ottoman Empire, to be beheaded. Nevertheless, the ideas of Wahhabism spread from Arabia to India because there were many, many pilgrims going to Mecca that learned about the Wahhabist ideas and brought them back, particularly in the northwest territories of India, near the border of Afghanistan and present-day Pakistan. There they established religious schools, madrasas, to carry on the Wahhabist ideas. This was taking place in the 19th century. It played a major role in the so-called Sepoy Mutiny that took place. And those ideas are present still there today and are fertile ground for the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Now, at the end of World War II, Wahhabist and Salafist ideas were given new life in the writings of Sayyid Qutb in his book Milestones, that basically inspired the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. One of those followers of his was Ayman al-Zawahiri, who joined Osama bin Laden to establish Al-Qaeda. I won't go into the history of Al-Qaeda leading to 9/11. That will be briefly. We'll try to take a couple of minutes and I will time for questions. Let me go into ISIS. ISIS is an offshoot of Al-Qaeda with these Wahhabist and Salafist ideas. The Americans invaded Iraq in 2003, I believe, but in the aftermath, there was this Sunni uprising, mainly the followers of Saddam Hussein, but they eventually included more and more jihadists who were at least allied with or sympathetic with Al-Qaeda. And their leader became Zakari, not Zawahiri, but Zakari. And he was trying to carry out the methods of Al-Qaeda, primarily against the Americans. In June 2006, al-Zarqawi was killed by a U.S. airstrike. His successor continued the operations. But the operation began to spread now. It included assassinations of Shia in Iraq, attacks on Muslims. The movement was largely thrown out of Iraq by the so-called American surge, which included diplomatic arrangements with the Sunni sheiks in large areas northwest of Baghdad. And the movement moved to Syria. The leader who followed Zakari was also killed by the Americans, and his successor was al-Baghdadi, the current leader, who had been imprisoned for 4 years by the Americans. And he famously said as he was left in prison, "I'll see you in New York." Now, we can't go into all the details, but we don't know all the details of what happened in Syria with the outbreak of the civil war against Assad. But this group began to engage all sorts of crafty maneuvers with other jihadist groups, the Al-Qaeda group, and with the Free Syrian Army, which was more or less democratic. And it began to have alliances, it would break the alliances, it would gain more and more control of the territory, particularly in northern and eastern Syria. And eventually claimed Al-Qaeda that it was in charge of this large group of jihadists called al-Nusra. The leaders of al-Nusra said, no, that's not the case. And this led to a split between al-Qaeda and al-Zawahiri, who succeeded in Islamic Islamism, and al-Baghdadi. And this group that now declared itself the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, the geographical region from southern Turkey down to Palestine. So we have a break. The reason for the break, among other things, because ISIS wanted to first carry on the attack against Muslims. They claimed that al-Qaeda was too mellow, too modern. In the spring of this year, this group moved out of Syria and basically invaded northern Iraq, taking over numerous cities and was at the gates of Baghdad, and still is. In June 29th of this year, ISIS declared itself no longer the Islamic Republic of Iraq and Syria, rather simply the Islamic Republic. It was the restoration of the caliphate, the only legitimate government on earth. It was going to establish radically the correct Muslim way of living and enforce Sharia law with a vengeance. It would be merciless against its Muslim opponents, and certainly was create an atmosphere of terror with respect to other groups and religions. And perhaps newspapers are full of this and full of the headings. Go to the website and you'll see videos of them slaughtering Shiites, bringing them down to the river and one by one executing them with a shotgun and dumping them in the river. That's their recruiting materials. And they do get success with their recruiting materials. They're now about 50,000 strong, we estimate, in their army. But they're drawing more and more like the girls that wanted to come from Denver. They're also advertising on their websites trying to inspire lone wolves like the person last week in Ottawa and in New York. They are masters of modern technology. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister of Hitler, is jealous of their use of the internet. It's an incredible development of nuclear revolution. So, this is what I wanted to know. Two main points. I believe, looking at it historically, there's a vacuum in the political culture, particularly in the Arab world, but throughout the Muslim world. Political culture, the keys, values, and inform a political way of life. There is no more caliphate. The regimes in the region of the Middle East are now dictatorships that have no real allegiance to the people. There is no source of political legitimacy. And into this vacuum come the jihadists, particularly now ISIS. Now there's only one other group in the world that I have this an allegiance. I think it's Boko Haram in Nigeria. So they may have alienated other groups, but of course they're claiming that they are the true revolutionaries. So I just end by saying this. I saw recently a newspaper describe members of ISIS as militants. They don't want to call them anything else, obscure Muslims. They want to be politically correct. Well, they are militants. But more recently, newspapers and the American administration call them terrorists. Well, they are terrorists. They certainly use terror. But they're not like ordinary terrorists. Terror is not a little tactic to get some finite gain. The only way to adequately describe them, I think, in seriously, they are radical revolutionaries. That really is the main point of my lecture. They are radical revolutionaries. That's why I spend so much time trying to say what they do. If you want to compare them with anyone, we don't know, of course, how successful they will be. The success isn't inevitable. They could implode. But there's no guarantee they will implode. They're smart. They're organized. We can't compare them with Paul Cotton. We can compare them with Adolf Hitler. Compare them with Joseph Stalin, we can compare them with Maximilian Robespierre, we can compare them with John Fawcett and Lee. We have to take them seriously. So I hope that it's ambitious. have to go back, of course, to when this group was still in Iraq and the American invasion, and of course they were involved in trying to disrupt the American military. But when the Americans left Iraq, and they had also basically left Iraq to be more Syria, this spring they invaded Iraq. And it was finally because of the videos of the beheadings of people that the American administration decided to engage in a bombing campaign as a more long-term plan. I believe the American administration hopes the most to get back the Sunni sheiks in these provinces north and west of Baghdad that have been lost because they were totally alienated from the Shiite regime in Iraq. But whether that will happen, we don't know, and that will be a mark of the political abilities of al-Baghdadi, how politically astute is he. He tries to simply make these rulers feel like they are totally subservient to him. They may not like that. So we'll have to see.
I think we have seeds for some of this type of activity in this country today. Recently, it's been reported in the news that former advisor Jerome Brady, not associated with Brady, I'm just saying he was an advisor, has come out publicly recommending for the South to secede again. There will be no gay people, there will be no black people, there will only be fundamentalist Christians, which in a way is looking much the same as the Sunni radicals. There's a group in this country, Christian Reconstructionists, who follow the teachings of God, Rashidi, whatever his name is, Rashidi, but anyhow, they're willing to go back to the Old Testament and consider a purist approach that will save this country. So how do we become aware in this country of the radicals in our own districts? Because it's not all just in this country.
No, I mean, there's an example of a radical revolution breaking out also. So you have radical Christian groups, so they'll have leftist groups that, those who argue against the 1%, claim that they themselves are kind of following the notion they represent the general will. You've got all sorts of potentials, all sorts of areas at the same time. Obviously, there could be groups that make proclamations and they're not going to really have much power behind them. They're not going to have political genius like Hitler or opportunities. But you do need to take them seriously.
Well, I think the Hollywood decision also help this stuff down, because a lot of these folks are pointing at the religious liberties and being infringed upon because they cannot control the conversation.
Well, you do have to differentiate between unjust group bias activity, radical revolution, and between moderates who want to reform, even with violence, and the radicals. So that's because we need to take the radicals really seriously. That doesn't mean there can be all sorts of other movements that are dangerous, but we need to be nuanced in our approach. And there are other movements in history that have been more than dangerous. The Mongols are not radical revolutionaries, but they slaughtered millions.
Given your conclusion that you view them as not only militants, terrorists, radical revolutionaries, what do you think should the rest of the world do to mitigate their advance? Not just, I'm not talking about the military.
First of all, you have to take them seriously. Don't think you're going to go through. I mean, they may implode. They may be checked by other, like Turkey and other countries. You don't know. But you have to take them seriously, particularly if they got all the biological weapons. They already are using chlorine gas and everything. And if they already got test nuclear weapons, then we're all in trouble. So you have to take them seriously in terms of actual military operations. So the point, all sorts of logistical considerations. I'm not going to advise the American military. I mean, the ultimate solution to it is to kill them. The radical revolution is that's the ultimate solution. Now, we're not going to do that. We're not going to do like the United States did in World War II with Dresden and Hamburg and Tokyo and Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We could destroy them right now. Destroy all the innocent civilians in their areas, but we're not going to do that. We're not quite like the Mongols. So, I mean, I can only say as a historian, That's the situation, and I hope the policymakers know the historical situation, and they can work out what they need to do. Dr. Lincoln, you are?
Yes, sir. I'm not going to think that you are a futurist.
What?
Futurist.
No,
But let me try
because
to
historians do not do well with prophets.
that is the issue because as a historical scholar and one who has gone through these various systems of revolutions. And then using your eyes, historical eye, where we are in the present. And the present that I'm describing is a dynamic presence, right? Dynamic presence are changing and constant all the time. To you, as a historian, historical scholar, see what you're really describing, having a futuristic impact or effect in how the rest of the world, right? I can't imagine the rest of the world will indeed deal with it. If we can destroy them, as you say, which to me is impossible to accomplish, because it's difficult to destroy them, which is the language of the president, will degrade and destroy. What does that mean? Because you use the same term. What does it mean to really take them seriously?
Well, first of all, no, they really do want this domestication. And they really do believe that any means is justified to do that. And I would suspect if I were in their place, I would certainly want to get Baghdad and Damascus. And I don't know that they can do that. I don't think they can do that. But certainly that would be my plan. And then Mecca, they would then establish themselves. I want to see their either with Muslim.
Well, they may not do it alone that. I thank you for this
Well,
opportunity.
there needs to be short-term and long-term issues.
Well, what is happening is that you mentioned the Boko Haram, right? Boko Haram in the migrate, the North
Oh, yeah. All the way
Yeah,
to Libya.
in fact, it isn't the same way the new country, right? And then you have the Saudis, or what happens in the Somali area.
40% of Arabians are Muslims.
Okay, exactly. So you see that they don't have to actually go in the direction we think they're going. There may be a congregation of different groups attacking.
Oh yeah, there's no question. I mean, right now they're metastasizing. So I don't think there's any imminent threat that this ISIS group will actually join others in some worldwide organization. Not right now. I mean,
But eventually,
that's what they want to do. I'm not convinced of that. But that doesn't mean that other groups can also cause problems, as you know, like in Nigeria. There's a general problem, as I mentioned, in the Muslim world, and eventually it's for the Muslims to work that out. In terms of political legitimacy and indeed what their religion in relationship to radical revolution. So there's things they need to do, and I have no idea what will happen when things are worked out how long it will take, decades, generations. They're in a historical transition phase, let's just say that. We don't know exactly where to go. So I think Marshall.
I was just going to comment that the older idea of containing that is considered rather than trying to exterminate it or eradicate it was probably the wiser choice. I mean, there's very few things in the world we've ever been able to eradicate. Even smallpox still exists in certain regions despite our best efforts. If I'll use an analogy. Of course, analogies are always a bit dangerous. They don't quite fit. But if you're trying to control a disease like malaria, now you can go around with a lot of fly swatters and swat as many mosquitoes as you can, or use insecticides and try to kill as many as you can, or you go after the environment that breeds them, and you change them.
Right, I agree.
And that's part of the problem here is that we have so many people who feel disenfranchised,
No question.
are in poverty,
Yeah.
who feel that they have no power at all, this gives them that feeling.
Absolutely.
And unfortunately, you know, the powers that be that are trying to manipulate things are trying to do it, of course, for their own self-interest, rather than trying to say our self-interest is actually going to be better served by working with these governments to create conditions that will weaken their field.
Yeah. Well, I didn't get a chance to go into any details, but every revolution is responding to real problems and injustices. And of course, if they didn't happen, you wouldn't have the ground for the development of the revolutionary fever. And we can talk about stupid diseases as revolutionary fever. There's a tendency, because the revolution eventually will buck up against reality. There's a tendency here to head toward the third order, and eventually maybe the whole thing will kind of could be contained like in the Soviet Union. But do you have that much time in the troublesome area where ISIS is in the Middle East? You could wait decades perhaps, and eventually, maybe they wouldn't be radical revolutionaries anymore. Like fossilized bureaucrats like in the latter days of the Soviet Union. But we don't necessarily have that option right now because it's rare to motive. But yes, among the many factors, diplomatic, question of foreign aid, there's a question of pressure on governments to do certain things. I mean, the governments are largely corrupt and authoritarian. They don't have any legitimacy. And the Arab Spring brought some democratic hope, but there's no real cultural tradition in those regions. Those groups that immediately established rival regimes. So there's no political tactic.
Yeah, but it occurred to me that you want to answer. I had a question along that comment that not everyone who feels marginalized is attracted to these kinds of ideas, fundamentals. So my question is really about the psychology of fundamentalism. It seems like your definition of radical revolution does a nice job of understanding the minds of the leaders. But what about the followers? What do you think is the psychology of people who are attracted to this kind of solution?
They're usually from the marginalized society. And they're co-opted in the revolution because they are participating in a major event in human history. They're bringing salvation to the world. They're pretty important people. So there's all these the leaders. You have to have the leaders who are able to appeal to them in that way. You have to have, it's a toxic triad of horrible circumstances, apocalyptic kind of circumstances, gullible, marginalized, oppressed followers, and charismatic leaders. So you just can't create revolution.
I just wanted to point out that terrorists who attacked the Twin Towers September 11th were not poorly. Some of them, I think I recall, had a master's degree, so marginalized, not necessarily poor.
Well, yeah, but I mean, the leaders, there's the chief leaders of the revolution. There are also others, like, a lot of lawyers in the French Revolution. We had PhDs that were high up in the Nazi final solution campaign. But the bulk, the larger group eventually, now Al-Qaeda is just a revolutionary movement. And we could argue whether, in fact, ISIS is really a regime yet. Do they have enough control yet to be a real regime? We could argue that. And some of it because of all the dangers.